thanks for the chance to speak about this tonight. It's interesting how many of the themes that I was going to address have already been touched on, both by Bill and our young colleague there, whose name I've forgotten. Lindsay, right? Yeah.
She's away, by the way.
One of the things was that Bill was mentioning was, it's not just independence, it's the quality of independence that's important, and when is independence independence. He also mentioned the fact that this isn't just a matter for the SNP. Actually, I feel quite thankful to the SNP leadership for raising this issue at this time, because in fact it's got us all started talking about and thinking about outside Scotland, how do we want Scotland to relate to the rest of the world. I think that's really not before time we're talking about that. And it's not just a question for Scotland, it's a question for the whole world. And I don't think this has dawned on a lot of people yet. Can I give you one example from my own movement, which is Trident Ploughshares? A few years ago I met a veteran from the Ground Zero campaign in Seattle, and anti-nuclear campaigners in the US get a really hard time. They're sent to jail for, some of them for as long as 18 years for protests. It's just an appallingly different system. But Bill said, I think Scotland's the key for the future of global nuclear disarmament. And he was just seeing how strategic our position is, that if we get rid of Trident, UK can't cope with it. And while that just applies to nuclear weapons, it applies to lots of other things as well, especially at a time when there is a kind of new Cold War atmosphere building up. And maybe just at the moment I could mention what are the indicators of that. The fact that missile defence is very much on the agenda in Central Europe, and also in this moment is well known by everybody, also in South Korea, where at the moment they are destroying a natural paradise in Jeju Island to set up a naval base that is formerly Korean but is actually just an American naval base for the Aegis destroyers who run the missile defence section in Asia, with China in mind. So, we're moving towards a Cold War kind of feeling of a thing. And of course it's not all in the US's fault, I recognise that, but that's the situation we're in. And where does Scotland, an independent Scotland, fit into that? Do we line up with one of the global gangs, the US gang in its various manifestations, particularly NATO, or do we join up with one of the other gangs, or do we actually look around and say, let's actually be in a different kind of community, which is about people and humanity worldwide, which is based on people who are doing the work, which is based on people who are struggling against oppression and poverty. That kind of alignment is what I think we should be looking for. And the NATO issue touches absolutely on that. I think we all realise we can't live in isolation as a nation in the future, where absolute independence is impossible. We're all interdependent. But I think what we're looking for is a measure of autonomy to be able to make our own decisions, and that's what Lindsay was saying earlier, that's what we're actually looking for. And the whole business of how we relate to the rest of the world is one of these critical decisions. And we need mental freedom and imagination to dream for what that's going to be. I'll tell you what's in my mind about that. For me, that means going beyond national self-interest to a vision based on saying, sharing, collaboration, starting with what our contribution might be to the worldwide community, investing in the skills of peacemaking and peacekeeping. Does this sound NATO to you so far? Developing expertise in conflict resolution, taking a firm stand in humanity and human rights, even when under pressure to wobble, and confronting security scares, showing you how a truly pluralist society can work, making worldwide links not restricted to the international between nations, but is actually with people to people, and so on. And you won't add so much more. And the obvious question for NATO is, why attach chains and cannonballs to your legs, when you start on this exciting vision-filled journeys? The pro-NATO people have made a number of arguments. If you don't mind, I'll mention some of them because you'll hear them, I'm sure, and it's good to see what substance is in them, if any, and be able to respond. One of them is that inside the NATO tent, we can have more influence. And we can decide, in fact, what bits of the NATO agenda we want to have. We can opt out of nuclear weapons, they say. They say also we can opt out of wars we don't like, etc., etc. This seems to me incredibly naive and illogical. Naive because within NATO, US calls the shots. And if you're in NATO, that's what will be happening. I don't know if you're aware of what's been happening in Germany in the last year or two. The German government has been attempting to get rid of US NATO nukes in Germany, which are tactical nukes with the new Cold War very much in mind. And they failed because they've just been told by NATO it's not happening. Furthermore, they've been told you will upgrade your Tornado jets so they can cope with the new weapons, and we'll upgrade these warheads. That is what will happen. Remember the Iraq War and the pressure that was applied to the so-called coalition of the willing to get involved, and how unwilling they actually were most of the time. Some of them going so far as just to send token amounts to kind of minimal amounts of troops just to say, right, we're part of it. Ireland, which wasn't even in NATO, still isn't, totally buckled to US pressure and allowed them to use Shannon Airport as a transit place, as you remember, for traffic to Iraq. So it's illogical. It's like joining the National Rifle Association in America in order to get guns banned, or the Orange Order in order to be nice to Catholics, or you can go on and on with examples of that sort. It's also morally dodgy because, in fact, while they hope to pick and choose their own agenda and what they'll do in NATO, presumably they'll still be content to remain under the NATO nuclear umbrella. Remember, NATO is a nuclear weapons alliance. I've also heard it, you probably heard this one recently as well, the claim that it will actually be easier to get rid of Trident nuclear weapons if we're actually part of NATO. And when I first heard this, I thought, am I going mad, or is everybody else going mad? But then I thought, actually, there is some kind of reasoning behind it. I don't think it's very reasonable reasoning, but this is how I think it goes, because they were talking about it yesterday at the Scottish Affairs Committee in the Parliament, in Westminster Parliament. The idea seems to be that, in fact, if you're inside NATO, you then will be talking to friends and you can negotiate. And pressure will be applied to the remnant UK to collaborate with Scotland in getting rid of nuclear weapons. And to my mind, at the back of that argument is the belief, and it's maybe not a conscious belief, that an independent Scotland will actually have little or no real ability to take decisions for itself. And this is a critical point. A lot of these commentators are assuming that Scotland won't have freedom of movement. And if you don't have freedom of movement, obviously you've got to join up with other people to get things done. And this is what they're calling negotiation. What I call negotiation is something quite different. You start with bottom lines. Trident's going to go. I'm taking the Trident as an example, but it's much wider than that. Trident's going to go, and it's going to go within a reasonable time. Then you negotiate and say, how can we, talking to the rest of the UK, how can we safely do it so we get the warheads down to Aldermas and get the nuclear scientists to dismantle them and get the whole thing done. And let's agree a very sensible, quick timetable. But at the back of the mind, there is the bottom line that these things have to be disarmed and removed as quickly as reasonably possible. Otherwise, what will we have? Fishery cruisers blockading Rue Naris and saying, right, the boats, the Trident submarines, it's the easiest thing in the world to do. You can almost do the canoes there. But the point is, it's a different kind of negotiation. And if Scotland is going to be what we call a sovereign nation, that's a horrible term, isn't it? They mean an autonomous one. Then we make these critical decisions for ourselves. We don't ask for favours. And this points out a really big contradiction in the position of the SNP leadership. On the one hand, they make repeated cast iron assurances of their intention to get rid of Trident. That indicates a position based on principle, and negotiations, like I described, based on bottom lines. On the other hand, Scotland's autonomy within NATO is to be diluted to the point that we have to ask nicely for Trident to go. Now, I can't hold these two things together, and my imagination is there's a ditch and one leg of the SNP leadership's at one side and one leg's at the other, and the ditch is widening, and we've got to decide which way to go. And we've got to do that at the conference in October. And if they don't, if they try to put it off, they're going to fall in the mud. And hell mended is what I say on that one. And while Trident illustrates this basic question about the nature of real independence, the principle holds true for all the other aspects of the NATO problems. Why compromise your autonomy from the start by putting yourself into the position of possibly opting out of a particular NATO aggressive adventure? Why tie yourself to one manifestation of a power block, etc.? And the other thing I haven't mentioned at all is that NATO is not just about war and nuclear weapons, it's also one of the handles by which the neoliberal economic rape and plunder agenda is carried forward. I don't know if you've been reading recently what's happening in Haiti following the earthquake. It's a really typical example of shock doctrine. After that natural disaster, the country has been opened up to be raped by corporations, and leading business people in Haiti have gone along with this. NATO is the kind of thing that makes that kind of thing possible. And if we believe in anything other than this kind of flat earth economics, then NATO we have nothing to do with. I've already mentioned the new Cold War, it's all part of it. Can I just mention one other argument that is made, which I think is very illustrative of what's going on here? They say, in fact, we'll inherit the NATO treaty, so that when Scotland becomes independent, we'll automatically still be in NATO, whether we like it or not. And this is based apparently on some international law precedents. You can find precedents on the other side. There's one in Algeria that actually works exactly the opposite direction, but I don't want to get into the argument about that. What I want to point out is that you don't usually start with international law, you start with the political will. And it's interesting that in Trident Ploughshares, talking to the Scottish Government about Trident, they would not take a position on international law on Trident. And the reason I'm now convinced is, if you take a position in international law, you're committed. You have no manoeuvring room. Trident's got to go under any circumstances. And they seem to be unwilling to take that step. Notice in that case, when the political decision came before the law, it was the same with the issue of the legality of the referendum. You can get arguments on all sides on that one as well, but, and actually I think quite rightly, the political decision comes first in that one. So, it's a referendum, let's go for it. But the point I'm making is that in the case of the idea of inheriting NATO, it's a political issue, it's not a legal one. And we can actually decide, no, we're not inheriting it before we actually become independent. It's absolutely possible. I want to finish this bit of it with a wee quote from a paper produced by the SNP CND branch, who've been doing really good work. Scotland should not sneak timidly onto the world stage, afraid of our own shadow. We should have the confidence to be brave and project ourselves as a modern nation with visions which are rooted in our concern for humanity. I don't think I could have said it better. What we do in the coalition is as follows. It was set up, I think, about 6 weeks ago or something, at really short notice. It's got lots of good solid organisations as part of it, including the Scottish Socialist Party, of course. And it meets, people meet regularly once a fortnight. We've done a few things. We had a nice die-in on Nagasaki Day outside the SNP office, and we met ran through a cabinet meeting and various other things like that. We also have a website, which is Nato Scotland, and I would urge you, if you haven't already done so, to go onto that and sign up and support, your signature support. And the other thing I may add, if you want to keep in touch with the Coalition News, there are 2 sign-up sheets there which you can everything. I'd be grateful if you. Obviously, we're looking ahead to the SNP conference, when we are hoping to have a presence every day, and especially when, and we seem to be not knowing exactly when it's going to be, when they'll actually debate the NATO question. So there's lots of ways to get to get involved and watch this space. Thank you.